going. So good morning, everyone. Welcome back to AIIDE, our last day. And I'm really excited to introduce Jeff Agenstein. And so Jeff is an award-winning tabletop game designer whose titles include Space Cadets, The Fog of War, Pit Crew, and The Expanse. He's also a noted podcaster. Since 2007, he has been a contributor to the Dice Tower, the leading tabletop game podcast, with a series of on the math, science, and psychology of games. He has also hosted Ludology, a weekly podcast on game design, since 2011. And recently published 2 books, Game Tech and Building Blocks for Tabletop Game Design. He teaches board game design at the NYU Game Center. So let's welcome Jeff. Thanks so much, Jeff.
Thanks, Libby. I'm going to try to position myself properly here. Okay. So thanks, everyone, for coming out early on a Saturday morning. I appreciate it. I know that I heard there was some late nights over the last couple of nights, so I appreciate everyone coming out. Okay, this works. So ever since the...
Just don't stand up first.
Got it. Ever since the Industrial Revolution, there's always been this vision of creating machines that are going to be able to play games against people. This is the Mechanical Turk, one of the first ones from the late 1700s, early 1800s, when they actually kept somebody hidden underneath to manipulate the chess pieces and play. And then jumping forward to the 1960s, this was a matchbox computer that was put together by Donald Mitchie back in 1961. How many of you here are familiar with Menace? Anyone? Okay, I'll explain a little bit more detail then. So he was one of the first people that was interested in machine learning, even though he was in the biological sciences. He wanted a way to sort of explore it a little bit more tactily and also be able to explain it to other people. So he made a computer out of a series of boxes that would learn to play tic-tac-toe. So this is 304 boxes, and each box has on it, okay, let's see if I can figure this out. Each box has on it a diagram of a tic-tac-toe position, and then in it there's a bunch of beads. And when it's Menace's turn to make a move, and it always moves first, is you would shake the box, open it up, and see which bead was in the little V part of the matchbox, and that would tell you what move to make, and then you would leave it on top of the box. And then you would make your next move, and then Menace would make its next move. You'd shake the next box based on the position. Then at the end of the game, depending on whether the boxes won or lost or drew, you would either remove or add beads to the boxes. All of the boxes in the string that led to that position. And he played it hundreds and hundreds of times, and eventually it learned and was never able to be beaten. And it's a really interesting project. They do it at science museums and things like that because it gives students a real understanding of what's going on with those types of systems. In 1962, because making 304 boxes, which is what you need for tic-tac-toe, can be too many, Martin Gardner in Scientific American invented this game called Hexapawn, which is just 6 pawns, and the objective is to get to a situation where one of your pawns reaches the other side or the opponent doesn't have a legal move. And this is a much simpler game, even though it's not totally obvious how to play. And in this case, you only need 24 matchboxes. And you can get these online. For those of you that teach artificial intelligence or are involved in it with students, this is a really great project to try to explain reinforcement learning, and can be a fun thing to do. So at this point in the 60s, there was sort of a split in the development of these types of systems after Menace. So there was the Silicon branch as computers became more and more developed, which is what all of you were involved in. But there was also a lot of development then on the cardboard side of trying to make opponents that could be manipulated, physically manipulated, like the matchboxes of Menace. And that's what we're going to talk about here today. So we're going to start, our tale starts with war games in the 1960s. This picture in the background here is a game called Fire in the East, which had thousands of counters. It's a simulation of World War II in the Soviet Union. This is Finland. The map's actually upside down. And these games took a lot of time, as you can imagine, and a lot of space. And one of the things that happened was it became difficult to find opponents to play these as the games got more and more complicated. This is from a 1978, I think, yes, copy of the General magazine, which was a war game-based magazine, and they had pages and pages and pages of opponents wanted sections. This is one of those pages. So they started doing studies and they started talking to people, and this is a quote from Jim Dunnigan from the mid-70s, who was the president of SPI, one of the leading war game companies. And he said that one of the earliest things they did when they did surveys is they found out that a tremendous number of people were playing these games by themselves. And the main way to do that was to simply play both sides. You would make all the moves for one side, and then you move to the other side of the table, and you make all the moves for the other side. So war game companies started to lean into this. One of the first things they did was on the back of their boxes, they put a rating for solitaire suitability, which is based on hidden movement and stuff like that. I, who also played a lot of these games in the 70s and the 80s, you started to develop this selective amnesia, where you move to the other side and then you forget where things were. But they would actually rate things. And then ultimately, the first game which was designed to play solitaire was released in the mid-70s as Operation Olympic, which was about the invasion of Japan, which had a very rudimentary AI for the Japanese side, which was modeled after the actual Japanese doctrine. So this kind of started this movement into making solitaire opponents in video games. So we're going to look at kind of three different models around this, and you can do them sort of along the classic narrative lines for three different types of stories of self versus other, or sometimes you say man versus man, man versus nature, man versus himself, or self versus other, self versus nature, self versus self is a classic narrative thing. In the gaming world, the terms we're going to use here, these are equivalent to PvP, player versus environment, PvE, and player versus self, which is one that's kind of not used as much, but we'll talk about that a little bit as well. And in general, PvP is kind of defined as playing against something that's actually trying to model another player, whereas PvE, you're playing against sort of a generalized environment. It's not as specific in terms of what you're doing. And play versus self was the old model where you were playing both sides, although there's some more modern takes on that, which we'll touch on a little bit. So a couple of other considerations in addition to this PvP, PvE style that I'd like you to think about as we go through these are that the players actually need to physically manipulate things. So whether it's in Menace when you're finding the little matchbox that's got the right pattern, or you're going through flowcharts, or as you'll see some different things, is that there's a physicality of it, and how much can players take to do that? How much are they willing to do in order to work through these systems? What does this mean for surprise? One of the things you always like when you play a game is, can you be surprised? And if you understand the entire system, how does the designer build surprise into it? And is the system reacting to the game situation? How does the AI, the artificial opponent, actually deal with other changing states? And finally, is there sort of an overall long-term strategy for the game? So one of the first games I want to talk about here is B-17 Queen of the Skies, which was from 1981, which is a player versus environment game. In this year, you play the crew of a plane, B-17, that is trying to do bombing runs over Germany in World War II. And this game is driven very heavily by charts. There's just charts and charts and charts, lots of charts. So on this chart, for example, you roll a series of things to determine what's going to happen. So up here, we start up here with, this is the number of German fighters that are attacking you, or the number of waves that are attacking you. You roll there and it says 1, 2, or 3. And then you roll on this table and it tells you the composition of the wave, the total number of fighters. Then you set them up on the board, and when they attack you, you roll to see for a plane when it hits you, how many shells it hits. This is where it hits you. Sorry, this table here is where it hits you, depending on the direction it's attacking from. And then once you've determined where it hits you, in the wing or in one of your crew members or whatever, then you go to this another table. This table here, if you get hit in the wings, you then roll to see what happens. Here is if you get one of your instruments gets hit, you roll to see what happens, and so on. It does not seem like a very exciting game. This is what it actually looks like on the table. But it has developed a tremendous following. It's even today. Said this is in 1981. This is from a convention that was from a couple of years ago, where people get together and they each run their own thing and they form a giant bomber run. I'm also going to see if I can get this working. Showing on the screen. Okay. So this is from last year. So this gentleman does these runs, and you name all of your crew members that are on the deck. And people put a tremendous amount of effort to bring these things to life.
Men, please come in and take a seat. You have already completed 5 missions. 3 have been successful, 2 so-sos, and still no failures. You have dropped an average of 22% of your bombs on target, which is good. Now, gunnery-wise, let's just say there's a lot of room for improvement. And improvement you will need, because today's mission is not going to be easy. Today's target is the shipyard at Rotterdam. This is in Holland. Your bomber will be in the middle position, but your squadron will be the high squadron. So you got a greater likelihood of encountering fighters. Here's the target in Zone 4. Now, since there's a lot of bomber squadrons in England, we cannot
This is
guarantee
the actual
fighter cover.
port of the
So
game
fighter
here.
cover quality will vary throughout this mission.
I love his
As you will
tweezers.
see, most of the trip.
But one of the
will be
things is to
flying
think about, now
over
this is all this
water
stuff he
to
talked
reach
about, the position of the
Rotterdam.
fighters and the targets, all that stuff, that's just die rolls on
Expected
those
enemy
charts.
resistance
right?
will
But
be
the
low
game is
to high.
giving the
Pretty
tools
high
to
run.
generate a story,
Expect 2 or
to
even 3
generate
fighter
this
waves.
narrative.
As I stated before, fighter cover will be variable from poor to good. In other words, don't count on it. Stay in formation, follow your captain's instructions, and good luck. The review copy takes off at 700 hours. Our bomber quickly enters Zone 2. Fighter cover is poor. The Germans, however, send no fighter waves at the bomber formation. Our bomber continues into Zone 3, where the fighter cover this time is good. The Germans this time send 1 fighter wave to intercept. However, these German fighters fail to make contact with the bomber formation. Unexpected cold temperatures jam the machine guns of Castelli, Young, and the tail gunner Viglino. The captain considers descending to 10,000 feet to unfreeze the jammed machine guns, but this would leave the bomber out of formation. He decides to stay in formation and continue with 3 jammed machine guns. As the bomber enters Zone 4, the crew attempts to unjam their machine guns, but Castelli, Young, and Viglino's machine guns remain jammed. The weather in the target zone, however, is good. Fighter cover is poor. And the Germans send 2 fighter waves after the bomber formation. The fighter wave makes contact. 5 Focke-Wulf 190s heading our way. An all-out attack from 9, 10:30, 12, 6 o'clock, and a vertical diving aircraft.
Okay, we're going to stop it there. I'll leave you with the suspense. So those are all, again, generated die rolls. And the only decision that the player made there through that entire sequence was whether to descend out of formation or stay in formation. Everything else was just narrative that was created by the die rolls. So that came out in '81, which is right around the time when Apple II computer games were starting to come out and stuff like that. So there was one of the first things that Avalon Hill was a game that was released was the B-17 computer game. And it seemed like a natural. Like it abstracted all those charts were all internal, so it would just tell you you're here and boom, this is what's happening and stuff like that. Came out, a bunch of people bought it, myself included, and it was an absolute disaster. It just wasn't fun. And what the lesson from that is that because you just pushed the button and said, I'm going to zone 2, and it just said nothing happens, or something happens, or the wing exploded, or whatever, is you didn't go through that process of rolling through the dice and going through the charts, right? So as you go through that, the time that it takes the player to manipulate all those features creates the tension and gives the space for the story to breathe. You can't just resolve everything. You have to slowly feed it out to the player. So first you roll, okay, fighter cover is poor. Okay, that's not so good. Then you roll to see how many waves are attacking. Then you say, oh, this one's 5 Focke-Wulf 190s. Oh no, my machine guns are jammed. And each of those little steps, even though you're not making any decisions, it gives the story time to build, lets the player build the abstraction around it, and that's what creates that love of this game, even 30 years later it is now. So it's an interesting lesson to draw from this. So the psychology around the players using the system can have a lot of manipulation in it, as long as that manipulation serves a purpose of engaging the player psychologically. Okay, so next I want to talk about this game Ambush, which was from 1983, so just a couple of years after B-17. The success of B-17 led for a lot of solitaire games that came out. So Ambush, which I have a copy of here, was a squad-level combat game, again from World War II. And this, I have to put this microphone down for a second. So this was all centered around this mission sleeve. So the way that this works is as you move your soldiers to each space has a designation. So like if you move to F3, you would line up F and 3 and you'd look in the little window and it would tell you what happened. So you could go space by space by space. And each scenario, each mission had a couple of these cards. As events happen, as events happened, you would change cards. There were certain things that could happen. So again, here's a close-up of what that card looks like. And one of the things that could happen is if you got a number, it would send you to this paragraph booklet. And that would tell you what was going on. So for some of them, like here, if you get 155, it activates a German and you commence rounds, which was the Ambush way of saying roll for initiative. And then you start playing a little tactical game, which we'll talk about in a sec. Sometimes it was more flavor text. Here's a man finds a frightened French boy in a small wine cellar, and things that happen. So that was the way that the missions were kind of generated. Once you activated a German soldier, it got one of these cards. Every single German soldier had a special card. It told you what number to pull out. So these are a couple of samples here. And then on here, first it gave you notes about special things for that, like here's a scientist. So if you capture him, you get 2 victory points for exiting him off the map with your squad. But it also told you these paragraphs. This is the AI for the soldier. This is what he does. So depending on the condition, and each mission had different conditions, which was like stages that it could step through. You would roll a die and cross-reference it and look up that paragraph. So that helped obscure initially at least what the opponents were going to do. And also let you very easily and succinctly put in these kind of special rules and different things. Like this one with the pistol, on his first turn you do 865, but other than that you're going to roll on this little chart and there's a lot of different things that the soldier can do. So it was a very clever and easy way for the designers to encapsulate a lot of information. This is a sample of one of these kind of activation things. So this is like 824, it says crouch and then conduct best fire at the easiest target. So it gives you instructions on what to do. The other thing that these cards did was they actually encapsulated, the Germans obviously moved, they didn't just stay in fire, so how do you know how to move on the map? So that was what those red numbers were. So what you would do is if a German was in H2, you would dial up H2 on the little mission sleeve, and when it moved, if there was a little red number under it, it would tell you the next hex that he was moving into. So basically the designer could pre-program movement paths without revealing those immediately to the player. Until the German went to move, you couldn't tell the next space he was going to move to. So there's a lot of really clever information hiding through this envelope system. So just to summarize, Ambush, so did a great job of hiding information, gave these alert levels to, every time it was a level, you switch the card out and went to a new card. It was, there was a lot of manipulation, a lot of rules that you had to do. But it really worked very well, and again, it's still popular. One of these games has never been reprinted, but people talk about redoing it. The big negative on it is you could play each mission one time. Once you played a mission, you knew the surprises. I mean, you could play it again, but you basically knew exactly what was going to happen and where everything was pre-programmed. But it was very clever the way that everything was encapsulated on the cards and in the paragraph book. So that's Ambush. So jumping ahead, so this is 1991. It was a game released called Peloponnesian War, which was about the Peloponnesian War. This is the board. So this was strictly released as a solitaire game. Now we're jumping up on the complexity level. So before with Ambush, you just had a couple of tokens on the board. With this, there was the entire theater of Greece and Persia, the Persian Empire that was back then. And you moved and had a lot of things to consider as you're going around. So how do you make a bot that can play a complex AI game like this? Well, in this case, the designer just completely punted. The way that this game was handled was that you played your side. You started with Athens, you played Athens, and you tried to win. But at certain points, you would have to switch sides and play the other side. So the other side was controlled by a rudimentary AI, and you made a fair amount of decisions. It was like a strategy matrix that you rolled on that determined the basic strategy for your opponent. But within that framework, you could pretty much do what you wanted with the opponent. But if you really hose them, you might have to switch sides and then have to play them from the now really terrible position. So even though you were playing against yourself, by having this, you didn't want to do terrible moves for them, but you wanted to do slightly suboptimal moves. So it kind of created this interesting puzzle situation. And it was interesting because ultimately to win, you had to defeat the opponent, but so you had to pick your moment when you were going to go for the win, because if you went for the win and failed, that was always pretty much when you were going to have to switch sides and then try to claw your way back up from the other side. So that was in the 90s. So in the 90s, though, the war game market really collapsed. The complexity of the games actually started driving people away, and the audience got smaller and smaller. And right around that time was when the European game school of board game design started becoming more popular, starting with Settlers of Catan in '96 and stuff like that. And in the year 2000, there was this game, Lord of the Rings, which was designed by Reiner Knizia. And this was one of the first big cooperative games. Now, before we've been talking about solo games, cooperative games you typically play with a team of people, and you're all trying to win or lose together. So in Lord of the Rings, it follows the story, and you have to work your way through these storyboards. This is the mortar board. There's 4 different boards that you work through, and eventually you have to throw the ring in to do it, to win the game. And the kind of the key design feature of this is that it was incredibly thematic. There's a lot of features. I'm not going to go into details, but if you have a chance, I would suggest you try this game. But there was a lot of very thematic elements. You're becoming corrupted, and corruption is advancing towards you. And if they meet, then your hobbits get removed from the game. You just feel oppressed the whole time. It does a great job of kind of capturing that. But there's no AI, okay? It is basically just a puzzle. And the way that the system works is that it just throws lots of stuff at the players. There's a lot of different threat axes that you have to balance all at the same time. And that game became really popular, and it started a huge wave of cooperative games. People realized that this was something that they want to do, and this was a different type of social experience, culminating with these games, Pandemic. People ever played Pandemic? Okay, there you go. Somebody knows B-17, but everybody knows Pandemic, that's good. Battlestar Galactica, which also introduced this sort of, not introduced, but had this sort of trader mechanic, and Ghost Stories. So all of these games were in 2008. And that was kind of the peak year for co-ops. And all of these games, there was no real AI. These all just threw lots and lots of stuff at the players. And that was how it created the threat level. There was didn't feel like you were playing against another player. Most of you have played Pandemic, so you're familiar with this, but the loss conditions, so there's a bunch of different ways that you can lose. And typical in these games is that there's one way that you can win, but there's many, many different ways that you can lose, and it becomes a prioritization issue of, do I worry about, Sao Paulo or whatever, there's this, you can have all the cubes being placed out, there can be a bunch of outbreaks that happen, or you can just go through the whole deck and run out of cards. So that was sort of, throughout the early part of the 2000s, that was sort of the design aesthetic. There was no real bots. There was no real perspective from that standpoint. I'm actually ahead of schedule. It's very exciting. So that changed a little bit in 2011 with a release of a game called Andean Abyss. So this is the map for Andean Abyss. This is a game about Colombia, South America. It's about the conflict in Colombia between the cartels and the government and the various forces there. And this is very much sort of a bot-based system. And this was also the first in what later became known as the COIN series, C-O-I-N, which stands for counterinsurgency. There's a whole series of games that are based around counterinsurgency. They all have, we're talking about 3 here, they all have similar characteristics. First is there's typically 4 factions. So these are the factions in Andean Abyss. I'll talk a little bit about these. These are the factions in a later one, which was A Distant Plain. This is about the Afghanistan war that's currently still going on. So the 4 factions there are the US forces, the Afghan government, the Afghan warlords, and the Taliban. So those are the 4 different sides in this. And you can, I put this up because I think most people are more familiar with this political situation than the Colombian situation from the 10 years ago. But these are all very much interrelated. Sometimes the U.S. does something good, which is good for the Afghan government or good for the warlords, and the warlords have to sort of work with the Taliban, but they don't want the Taliban to get too powerful. So there's a lot of interrelatedness between these different factions, which is the hallmark of this whole game series. So there's a couple of things going on. So you got 4 players. It's highly asymmetric. What the U.S. government forces can do is very, very different than what the Taliban forces are allowed to do in that game. And you've got this coupling. So if you have to have 4 players, right? If you only have 3 players, like you can't drop the Taliban out, you can't drop the U.S. government. I mean, it's very difficult to disentangle these forces. It's going to change the way that the game goes quite a bit. How do you deal with that? And the way that the designer dealt with it was by introducing bots that could play the faction. And it wasn't because he thought bots were cool, it was really a commercial necessity. It's just like, no one's gonna play this game if you always absolutely have to have 4 people. So what he did was develop, and this is the one from Andean Abyss, this is for the FARC faction. So if they're not playing, he developed these flow charts that the players would have to go through. And these initial ones are actually relatively simple, so there's just a series of questions. Does FARC have 9 or more guerrillas that they can place on the base? If so, then they're going to do this action, and then you go through these different steps, and it ultimately walks you through. But this is relatively straightforward. The one games and would just play 4 bot players against each other. And people started to do that just as a learning experience for how to learn the games. These games can be complicated, and if that walks you through all the steps, it can be really helpful. But just in general, these games, this whole series, and there's like 11 of them now, there's a fair number, they are measured by the quality of their bots. It's a big thing that when people go out to buy it, that they look at how good are the bots. And so they've started to get more complicated. So just as a comparison, so this is the one from the American Revolution War, which is called Liberty or Death. And in this case, there's 4. The 4 factions are the Patriots, the French, the UK, and the Native Americans. So those are the 4 different factions in this case. And you can see that there's more complication in these flowcharts than there was in the initial Andy and Abyss one. There's also a lot more special cases down here. This game is also played through a series of event cards, and this tells you kind of how to deal with some of the events. And these, just for completeness, these are the this is the Indians and the British. So again, they've gotten more complicated, and people are starting to judge this, and people like it. They like the fact that they have a lot more flexibility in how they play. One thing, though, is that even though they have these bots and they're sort of playing by the rules, they're not totally playing by the rules. They've got their own set of abstractions and things that they do, so they're not strictly taking the place of a player. To give you some idea also of how important these are, for Liberty or Death, which I just talked to you about, there's 40 pages of rules. And out of that, 11 pages is specifically about how to run the bots. So that's, that's a very sizable percentage of the rules that are being taken up by that. So let's take one step further. So Empire of the Sun was introduced in 2005. This is, as you can see, a game about the Pacific War, during World War II. That was before the coin games. So the coin game, remember, was 2011 was the first one. So this was before, and it was okay. It was fairly popular, but it wasn't, it wasn't a huge success. But it always had a nice place in people's hearts. Then in 2018, the designer decided to go back and make a bot that could play this game because he saw he had some experience in playing. In developing bots for other games, and thought that it might be an interesting exercise to do it. And the reason is that this is a very, very complex game. This is like one of the games that's at the top of the complexity level. So this is the board, what we're looking at here. So you can see that, and this is just part of the board. It actually extends all the way through over to Hawaii, and up to, this is a little bit further north of this. But you've got units for, you've got naval units, you've got air units, you've got ground units, you've got supply to worry about, you've got convoys to worry about. And every single hex matters in terms of placements and stuff like that. In contrast, this is the board for Liberty or Death. Okay? So here you've only got a couple of different spaces. So each of these little boxes is a space. So there's basically one for each colony. And you just put cubes on the board. So it's not a lot of different types of units. So it's much easier to kind of tell the system which way to go. So again, for comparison, this is the Empire of the Sun board. The other complexity in Empire of the Sun is unlike the coin games. In the coin games, these are event cards, and they do kind of revolve around these cards, but there's one card that's face up and all the players use it. So there's no real choice. In Empire of the Sun, you start with a hand of 7 cards, and you have to choose each round which one you want to play. And each card can be used for multiple purposes. They've got an event on it which could be used. They've got this number which can give you different types of activations. These let you do different types of offensives. So there's a lot of different things that are going on. So this is a very, very complex game to try to create something to play for it. And these were the goals that Mark set up for it. He wanted the bot to play by the actual rules. He wanted it to be a reasonable opponent. It's not going to win championships, but he wanted it to at least put up a decent fight. And he wanted it to help players learn. So this is what he ended up with. So I think this is going to be perhaps the pinnacle of these bots. So this is for the Japanese. Now this is just the Japanese opening phase flowchart. There's 3 of these. I'll show you all 3. This is the Japanese opening phase flowchart. But a couple things he did. Remember, go back to what we talked about. So first you start here. You go through each of these things, and there's a list of conditions. So again, very computerish. Our Allied HQs in the Philippines, DEI, or DEI surrender, objective occupies to Japan have 3 or more cards, and so on. You walk your way through all these, and that sends you to one of these boxes. And one of the things I like about what he did with this is that these boxes are named in terms of different strategies. Aggressive air superiority strategy, the CBI strategy, defensive perimeter strategy. So as a teaching tool, now that's giving the player some kind of context for what you're doing. It's not just like, now go to box M or N or over P, which he could have done. It gives you context to understand what you're trying to do. So once you pick the strategy, these are the strategies over here. So if you're in the Central Pacific strategy, these are the first you're going to go for Northwest New Guinea, Attu or Kiska, defend the Marshalls. Defensive perimeter, you have the Australian mandates for New Guinea. If you have Australian mandates, it tells you up here what that means. It means try to get Rabaul or Guadalcanal are your priorities. So that's a first stage of the bot, is just to determine what the priorities for the bot are based on the current card play. You're supposed to do this every single card before you play, but it doesn't change that much, so it tends to keep you in the same strategy. This is the same chart, but this is for the mid-game phase, and it gives you also direction on when you would change from the opening phase to the mid-game, because again, the opening phases of the war, the Japanese are conquering and they're moving out and trying to take stuff. In the mid-game, it's more about balancing what you're doing and setting up a perimeter. And then finally, there's the end-game phase chart, which is much simpler, which is basically you just kind of defend the islands, create your perimeter, and defend. So once you've established that, then the next thing is to go to the card that you're going to select for the bot. Again, you have a hand of 7 cards. Same kind of a flow chart. Again, puts you into a different strategy for what you want to use the card for. And then over here, it tells you how to pick the card based on the criteria that you end up. So both a card selection system and a teaching tool that does both. And then finally, once you've picked the card that you're going to play, most cards involve you doing an operation, which is sending out ground forces or aircraft or ships, is you have to develop what's called a task force. And this is the task force composition. And this is actually where the players have the most freedom. It basically gives you guidelines, like you're going after this objective. I'm trying to take Manila, and is the first objective. And then the player has the freedom within sort of this framework to establish what exactly the force composition is going to be. And it tells you, do the forces until you have this percentage chance of winning based on the combat results tables. And then the last element of the bot is the reaction. So there's a whole reaction system. When player moves, then sometimes you can try to intercept them, you can try to surprise them, and this controls the Japanese reaction. So those are all the flow charts. And there's a comparable set of flowcharts for the US side, which I'm not going to bother showing you, but they look very similar. So a couple of things to note about this system. Obviously, it's way, way, way more complicated than the other stuff that we were seeing, but it accomplishes a lot of the goals that we talked about. So it helps to define a strategy. That's one of the things that coin games bots don't really do, is they have some basic criteria, but here, the computer, the AI will kind of go into it'll go into a strategy from that first flow chart. It's going to stay there for a couple of turns unless the situation changes radically, and it will pursue that strategy until it takes things out and then moves on to a different strategy. So it defines that. It's very reactive to the board state. There's 3 different flow charts: opening game, mid-game, end-game. So that will evolve the strategy as it goes. It's not just the same over and over again. And it gives the player a little bit of freedom, but not a lot of freedom, and it's very, very helpful for learning the game. So was all this effort that the designer put in to develop this worth it? I have been told that the sales of the game since this came out have shot up quite a bit. This has generated a lot more interest in the game. So I think maybe at this point I would say yes, but time will tell. He certainly spent a tremendous amount of effort, and to have to do this for every single game that comes out is going to start being prohibitive. But it's a very interesting exercise, and I'm really curious to see. I have not tried it myself. I don't have that kind of time in my life, I guess, to kind of work through everything. But a lot of people really enjoy it and enjoy, going through those manipulation steps that we talked about all the way back in B17. It gives you the opportunity to kind of step through and experience the game. Okay, so European games, as I mentioned in cooperative games, it really wasn't bots per se. They were all kind of PvE style play of lots of stuff coming at you. But starting in 2014, there was actually a formal movement by this one gentleman in particular to create this thing called the AIIDE system, which first introduced in this game Viticulture, which is about winemaking. That was done in 2014. And he called this Morten Monrad Peterson, is the gentleman's name, and he developed this system that he called the AIIDE factory system, which was a way of creating bots, unlike PvE, make it more PvP, create like another opponent that you could play against. but do it in an interesting way. And his thing was focusing on the interactions between the players and not what's internal. So, what can the other player do to you? And I liken this, so I do my share of coding, and I'm sure a lot of you folks do coding, and when you're programming or even just other types of engineering, a lot of times you focus on the interface between your objects. Right? You don't worry about the internals of the object. You focus on how that object is interfacing with other things. And that's basically what the automa is. The automa is saying, how do the players interact with me? And I don't worry about all of the stuff the player has to deal with to create those interactions. I'm just going to generate those interactions. And that is what the bot should be focusing on. So one game that this was done for recently, which I'm going to talk about because some of you may have played it, called Wingspan. Has anybody here played Wingspan? The bird watching game?
Wow.
No. Okay. This is an interesting game. So this game just won the Kenner Spiel des Jahres, which is one of the most prestigious board game awards, and it is about bird watching, and it's become like super duper popular. I think there's already like over 100,000 copies sold, which is a lot for this type of a board game. And it comes with an automa opponent. So this is what the board looks like. You're trying to collect these birds. And they can go into different habitats. Each of these stripes here is a different habitat. And there's a lot of different things that you're trying to do to collect points. There's different bonuses, but each bird is worth points. But it gives you fun bird facts on each card too. So one of the big things you do in this game is you play a bird card. So this is the common raven. It's not very, and in order to play it, you first have to have the card in your hand. You have to play food based on this number up here. So in order to play a raven, you need a rat plus any 2 other foods. You have to put it on your mat into the correct habitat. These are the habitats it can go into: the water, the plains, or the forest. And you have to pay eggs, or these little egg tokens. You can kind of see them a little bit behind this picture. You have to pay eggs based on how many other birds you have in that habitat. And then there's abilities that get activated when the card is placed. Now, a lot of these are what, from the automa perspective, would be considered internal stuff to the player, like having the card bird in hand, paying the food based on what is on the card. Even really just playing the card at all doesn't directly affect the other players. It's all this stuff is what you do in your map. So the automa in this case is run by just a series of a couple of cards. So this is a reference card. So these are the different actions that it can take. We're going to talk about this one in a second. What you do is, depending on the round, is you flip one of these 11 cards, and it shows you, in this case, you would remove food dice. There's these food dice. You take food dice out of the tray. So in Wingspan, there's only a couple of ways that the other players actually impact what you're doing. You kind of tend to play on your own for a lot of it. There's bird cards that are face up, like rummy or something, and so the other players can take those cards that you may want. There's dice out there, the food dice that are public, and sometimes your opponents can take the food dice. They can trigger abilities that you may have on your birds. And there's also these end of round bonuses, and you may want to try to get the highest, most number of certain types of birds or whatever it is. There's a whole bunch of them. And ultimately, score more points than you win the game. So going back to these abilities, they're very, very, that's what the automa is designed to do, is interact with you in the same way. So take bird cards that you want. So that's this draw action here. So in this case, if the automa, it triggers this ability, it discards all 3 bird cards, and you draw all new cards out on the display. So that has just foiled your plans for what that is. Taking food dice, that's this ability here, and it takes them out in a certain priority. Triggering your abilities, if you get that pink one, then you get to do all your pink bird abilities. End of round bonuses are these 2 things for the cubes. Those are, you put those on bonuses, and that says how much progress the player has made. And when it's actually placing bird cards, it's plain bird cards, it does this, and it also takes them out of the center tray. And the automa just plays them out. It doesn't have to pay the food or anything like that. It's very, very simple. So each one of those elements, those interface elements, is emulated by the automa. So one of the questions, and the automat likes to use cards. I told you there's the cards that you flip up each time. So why not dice? Why not just roll a die and have different sides on it, or have a chart that you look up? And one of the clever things that this does is, there's only 11 of these cards, is that cards give a lot more control. Cards have a lot more control for the designer over what's going on in terms of the probability distribution. If you're just rolling dice each time on a chart to see what the automa is going to do, it could be take food, take food, take food, take food, take food, and never mess around with the birds. And a player would never do that. An actual opponent would never do that. You always need to do a balance of actions. So by having those just 11 cards that get flipped up with different aspects, that gives more probability control to the designer over what's going on. The automa kind of activates, occupies a weird space. So this is sort of a continuum on your PvE to PvP type games, PvE being more puzzle-oriented, PvP where you feel like you're actually playing against another opponent. Automa is kind of in the middle. It's sort of emulating an opponent. It's pretending to be an opponent, but at the same time, it still feels very puzzly. It doesn't, you don't get that same feeling like you do when you're playing the Erasmus bot in Empire of the Sun or something like that, or one of the coin bots. But still, it has become very popular, and it is in a ton of different games. It does have a lot of these other issues that we touched on. There is no strategy for it. You're just flipping cards, and that's what it is. There are sometimes, there's a game that just came out called Tapestry, which is a civilization building game, and that has an automa bot. And in that one, you define like each opponent has a special, if they like technology, or they're the engineers and they want to build lots of buildings. So you can set like flavors for them, but it still doesn't really define a strategy in the same way. There are also not as many surprises. There's 11 cards in the deck. You know what it's going to do. It just feels more like, which it's supposed to do, that it's kind of getting in your way, but it's not really reacting to anything that you're doing. There's no reaction. So, okay, we're in excellent shape. This is the last one I want to talk about here. So this is a more recent thing than a little bit later than the automas, which is now the European games, or the more traditional designer games like Pandemic and stuff like that. The automa has sort of been the major way of creating AI in there that's become popular lately. But there's a new one that's been introduced in a couple of recent games. So in 2015, there was a game released called Kingdom Death Monster, which is insanely expensive. It's like $400 to get a copy. I don't have a copy. But I do have a copy of this. Gloomhaven, which was released in 2017, which has also become very popular, which is a little over $100. Has anyone here played Gloomhaven? Okay, there we go.
I have a box.
Yeah. Gloomhaven is about to get a lot more accessible. They just announced that they're doing a smaller box version that's going to be like $40 or $50. Gloomhaven has a huge campaign system, and it's like a legacy system and all kinds of crazy stuff going on. And it's an incredibly heavy box. The size of this, the image on the screen here, actually that one's probably about life size. So it weighs a lot. It's a very, very heavy box. The system that was introduced in Kingdom Death and Gloomhaven is specifically the one I want to talk about, is around the creatures. So in both of those games, you're kind of like dungeon crawling, and when you get into a room, there's all these creatures that pop up and they have to run and attack you. Typically, the way most games have handled that is they've either had them on player control, or they've created a very, very rudimentary AI, like they run straight towards you and attack you as fast as they can, or they run to the closest person. In Space Cadets, which was one of my games, is a space game, but I use that same system for when enemy spaceships are attacking you. When they activate, they just charge towards you as quickly as possible and shoot at you. So there's no subtlety in the design. They came up with a much more subtle way of doing it in these two games. For every different type of creature in the game, there is a small deck of cards that controls what the creature can do. So this is the one from Kingdom Death. This is the terrifying roar card. But I want to talk more about Gloomhaven, just because I have Gloomhaven in my basement. It was easier for me to take pictures. There's 8 cards for each creature. So this is the cards for the guard deck. So when you're facing guards, you would construct this deck. And when it's time for the guard to activate, you flip one of these. And these are basically modifiers on the key stats. So the guards have a stat. They have a movement stat and an attack stat and a range combat stat and all that stuff. But this is just a modifier to it, which is a clever way to do it because it lets them have multiple levels of guards, and you can still use the same deck, so it gives some flexibility. So in this case, if I flip up this card, it's just going to move and attack with its standard one. But here, it's going to move slower, but it's going to attack with 1 extra strength. So it adds that surprise element. A couple of other features here. So that number in the corner is the initiative. So that controls the speed relative to the action that you choose to take. So sometimes they may activate before you or after you. And finally, that little icon down in the corner there is a reshuffle icon. So when you flip that one up, you reshuffle the whole deck and start the 8 cards over again. So this has a lot of uncertainty into what's going on. So you can't make a perfect plan when you're trying to decide what to do because you don't know exactly how fast they're going to be able to move. I mean, yeah, it says they can move 4 spaces on their card, but maybe they'll only be able to move through. Maybe they'll be able to move 5. The other fun thing that this does is that it also allows give the players discoverability. So the first time you run into a monster, you don't look at all the 8 cards. You just pull the 8 cards out of the stack and shuffle and put them down, and you don't know what's in there. And for some of the more advanced creatures, they start adding other types of abilities. Here's the archers. So archers, you've got a new type of thing here where it's this targeting, it's just like an aiming action. So it just kind of stays there and it'll just try to aim, and then ultimately on some other cards it'll shoot. Here's a special attack now, it's got an immobilize. Maybe you didn't realize that that was something that archers could even do until that card comes up. And then finally, this is the Flame Demon. So now you're starting to get into more complicated systems. Spoiler for those, I guess, that are playing Gloomhaven, of what the Flame Demon can do to you. But now you've got more complicated things. So this is like a fireball attack. So it's going to attack all 6 of those hexes, and so on. Also, this is starting to interact with, this is creating a flame element in the environment, and then some of these later attacks consume a flame element in the environment if it exists. So for those of you that play Dark Souls, for example, one of the fun things about Dark Souls is learning how to beat the creatures. And when you first fight a creature in Dark Souls, you don't know what it can do, you don't know what its special attacks are. And there's that learning, there's that feeling of progression, there's that feeling of mastery that you gain as you encounter it over and over again, and you die and you go back and you die and you go back and you die and you go back, and eventually you figure it out. Gloomhaven and Kingdom Death Monster have captured that same thing with these small decks of cards. You can come back to the Flame Demon, and as you're fighting it, you're so, oh, I didn't know it could do a fireball. Maybe you could assume certain types of things, but you don't know exactly what it is. But then the next time you face it, you're more experienced, you're wiser, you can plan better, you can use more tactics. So it just gives the system a lot more feel of depth. So it does allow players to learn creatures' abilities, but it gives room for surprise. You don't know the full range of everything that can happen, especially the way it modifies the movement in combat and stuff like that. Even though just you see it says 4 spaces, that's not necessarily it. And it also gives the designer a lot of space on those cards to add a lot of different actions. This harkens back to Ambush, the very beginning, those little cards for each soldier where you can have the special rules on each card. It gives you a lot of, as a designer, you want to make things easy to manipulate and easy to deal with, and Gloomhaven did a really nice job with that, as did Kingdom Death. And it gives you lots of design space. So you've got, in addition to what's on the card, you can play with the initiative. Maybe there's more reshuffle icons, less reshuffle icons. There's just a lot of different little features to play with. But you've got a ton of cards, okay? There's 262 just of those creature cards, and every time you add a new creature, it's 8 cards, so it's a very component-heavy system. That's why these games are so expensive. So, to summarize, 60 to 1980, we had war gamers that were just kind of playing all sides of the system. And then, beginning in 80 and 90, you had a lot of creativity that resulted in things like B-17 and Ambush, Peloponnesian War, stuff like that, where people were exploring how can we build more interesting, creative dynamics into these solitaire games. Then we got into the period with just the multiple threat axis was sort of the general design technique. And then finally, we've developed these more modern systems, the flowchart bots, the automa systems, some of these card-based systems. I'm sure there's more that's coming, but I feel like there's a lot more kind of, there's more interesting and advanced designs that are coming out now than we had back in the day. And kind of the key things that I've kind of taken away from reviewing this and just living through this period is that first, players want solo experiences. There is an absolute market need that players want solo experiences. I have a game coming out next year called Versailles 1919, which is about the negotiations around the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War I, which the market has been crying out for. It's a negotiation game. You play the UK or the US or France or Italy, and you negotiate over the treaties. And when it was announced, the first thing that people were all posting was like, is there going to be a solo mode? I'm like, it's a negotiation game. You know, why would you want a solo mode? But we put in a solo mode. The publisher wanted it, so we put it in and actually modeled it after Peloponnesian War. You actually switch sides if you're doing too well. At certain points, you have to switch to the lowest ranked person. So you have to balance the negotiations. But the market wants that now. There's expectations that there's going to be a way to play a game solo when it comes out. The other thing is that players are absolutely willing to do more manipulation than you think they are, than I thought that they were. The bot for Empire of the Sun, even B-17 going back, you know, people, as long as it gives them some agency and gives them that it's not just manipulation, but each step is giving you sort of a little burst of story for a little point, like in B-17, people are absolutely willing to do that even though they're not making choices step by step by step. Flowchart systems are really good at reacting to the game state, but card-based systems can capture your unpredictability. So, I'm at 55 minutes. So I posted on Twitter a couple of days ago that I had 125 slides that I was doing in 45 minutes. And I was really excited because Scott McCloud, who I'm a huge fan of, who wrote Understanding Comics, which you should absolutely 100% read, actually responded to me and told me his 45-minute presentation has 350 slides. So that gave me the courage to come out here and do that. So I was excited about that. Anyway, so just again, some of my games. So I did the board game for The Expanse TV show, Space Cadets, Dragon and Flagon, lots of different games here. I don't have Versailles on this list yet. Dice Tower and Ludology, which I just recently left Ludology after doing 200 episodes. But the show is still going on, and mine are still up there if you'd like to go back and listen. I've got 2 books, a 3rd book coming out now, Achievement Relocked, which is coming out from MIT Press in February, which is about the psychology of loss aversion in both video games and board games design, which I'm very excited about. So if you'd like to check any of those out. And with that, I will take your questions. Thank you.
So, go ahead.
Do we have time?
Yeah, we do have time.
Okay.
Please.
Yeah.
Oh, me?
Yes.
Something that strikes me as working with video game design AI, there's kind of obviously in this sort of thing, it has to be very easy to follow. It can't be, you can't rely that you're like players or have programming knowledge, things like that. And there's kind of a similar movement in the game AI design thing, which is like we want to make AI that's accessible for non-programmers to put into their games. And one of the big success stories there was behavior trees, which was this really kind of like very simple rule-based way to follow, and you can sort of get really complex behavior out of them. And it strikes me as something that could be very easily published as something that I guess looks kind of like one of those flowcharts. I mean, maybe those flowchart bots are like equivalent to a behavior tree. I was curious if you, firstly, does the word behavior tree even like make sense? Like, is that a thing that you know about? Am I using a familiar term? And then do you know of any games that have used a system like that?
I'm familiar with it on a limited basis, but I agree that I think the flowcharts to a certain extent have that, where the first step is to look at all the game environments. So do we meet this requirement? Do we meet this? Do we meet this? And then based on that, we choose what we're going to do. But yeah, I mean, I think that there's space for doing that in a simpler way with like a card-based system. It doesn't, like most people, I mean, war gamers or whatever, they're willing to look at a flowchart and not freak out. But most, normal gamers, I say that as a war gamer, would be freaked out if they took a 12-page flowchart out of the rule book. So, yeah.
How important do you think it is that everything remains analog? Because I mean, you can imagine that you have like an app on your phone that allows a bot that's part of the board game.
Yeah.
But it feels wrong to me somehow. I
don't know. Well, you're not alone in that. I'm fine with that. And there's a lot of examples of that. There's a lot of systems that are out there that do that. There's a submarine game called I forget what it's called, but there's a submarine game where the app basically plays the other ships and you're just in the submarine and it does all that. I specifically didn't talk about those. There's tons of those out there, but it certainly is a lot easier to create AI and have the opponents controlled if you can have an app. And there's a lot of people that are strongly opposed to that. Just like you said, it just feels wrong. I don't agree with that, but you read all the time, like it's like, oh, well, if Android updates to a new OS and all of a sudden I can't play my board game anymore. Where and on my thing is, well, you have the same thing with, you bought a video game and you can't play, a video game that you bought a while ago, but that's the way it goes.
So like one thing that's interesting to me is Ambush is very heavy on the obfuscation and trying to confuse the players to what's going on. And you mentioned Erasmus has the names for well, this is the sort of general strategy.
Yeah.
So the Erasmus, to me it seems like Erasmus is good for edification, but if it also gives it away if you're playing against it to be oh, they're going for the defensive strategy, I can know to counter that. Do you think that there's it's an aesthetic choice as to when you want to obfuscate and when you want to give sort of clue the player in as to what's going on, or would it be obvious to someone playing the game being oh, this is a defensive strategy, or what are your thoughts on that?
I think that they run, they run counter to each other for sure. But I think that it's the obfuscation is if you want obfuscation, the trade-off you're making is you either have to have a simpler game system. Because you can't have the player make as many choices because the whole guts of it have to be laid bare in order to make the choice, or you have to have it only be limited numbers of times that you can play. So it's baked into the mechanics and somehow just open this next envelope and it tells you what the computer is going to do, what your opponent is going to do, which is what Ambush did, which I have. In case somebody wants to look at it, I brought my copy. So I think it'd be hard to both have something that's more generalized and replayable and complex and hidden. I'm not sure if you can hit all of those.
You mentioned discoverability, and there are two challenges that I see with discoverability. The first being that obviously once you discover something, it's hard to make a system where you can rediscover it. But the second is that if discoverability and kind of learning your way through the game is the main challenge of the game, then once you've mastered that, the game may become trivial. Have board game designers struggled with that, figured out ways to deal with that?
Yeah, there's been, just having this conversation with Levi earlier today, but so either you're gonna, something like Gloomhaven, so you have that discoverability, but even once you know all the cards and you've memorized all the cards, there's still challenge there, right? There's still that puzzle to manipulate. So you lose that element of it, but that's why there's 262 of those creature cards. You can keep experiencing new creatures. The other way that game designers have dealt with it is by creating what are called legacy games, where there's discoverables that get unlocked as you go. But they have a limited number of plays, like Risk Legacy or Pandemic Legacy are designed to be played 12 to 18 times. The interesting thing about board games is that there was always, as a designer, there's always this patina of replayability is super important in board games. And lately, that's kind of been going by the wayside to a big way. There's about 4,000 new board games released each year. And certainly hobbyists are flitting from one to the next and the other thing. So, maybe you play a game 3 times, maybe you play a game 5 times, but it's not like a game needs to stand up to 50 plays or 100 plays like it used to. And so you see legacy games, there's a lot of these escape room type style games where they're designed to do it once. You play it and you do it and it's an activity and you're done. So I think that as designers adjust to this new reality of you don't need a whole bunch of replays, that's going to open up a lot more opportunities in the design teams.
So we have time for one more question.
Who's got a really good question? If you don't think they're a really good question, Richard. Okay.
Okay, so since you mentioned Dark Souls, I'm actually wondering, one thing that how you balance surprise and first time play, frustration. Let's say that just use that example that you have 8 cards actions for an enemy, and let's say that's an enemy that has 7 cards doing nothing and 1 card that insta-kill your party. what do you think of that kind of behavior since you can't know what is happening out there?
Well, I think that would be a really bad design choice. But you know, part of Gloomhaven is you're not expected to win every time, right? Part of it is what happens if you lose encounters. If you just won every single encounter, it wouldn't be fun. So you don't want to have it so crazy, but I mean, it does tell you before you go into an encounter, you know, it unlocks certain creatures in a specific sequence, so theoretically you should be ready for it or close to ready for it. But there's certainly instances where you get in there and you're just overmatched and you're just, you know, get wiped. So that's a function of the designer just kind of creating a gating process to make sure that people are, you want, you know, it's that zone thing. You don't want people to be too easy or too hard. You want it to be right in the middle and trying to keep people in that area.
Obviously, running is also a strategy, right?
I'm sorry, what's
I mean, running, escaping is also a strategy in that sense.
Yeah, but dying is not horrendous in Gloomhaven. So I mean, if you lose the encounter, you just lose the encounter. You don't, you know, you just go and you try it again. You suffer maybe a small penalty, but it's not like your party's wiped and you have to start the game all over again. It's not like that. So, okay, well, thank you all very much. I'll be around. I have Ambush here in case anybody wants to check it out. And thanks again.
Yeah, we're gonna have a coffee break now. I heard
Right
it
here?
was supposed to be here. Oh, so it's right there. So yeah, coffee break.
A quick announcement, please do not use the stairwell today. Ask John and Stephen what the consequences can be of using the stairwell.
Can't get back out.
If you do use the stairwell, make sure someone has a phone with you so you can contact your friends and come and rescue you.
Actually, I got stuck in the stairwell this morning when I came in. And you can actually get out if you go all the way down. There's an exit out by the stadium.
Still working? Okay, well that's reassuring. But the elevators are fine, and also our coffee break is up here, so hopefully it won't be a big deal.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, right. I feel like told me that you can group engagement in the area. I was downstairs and get out like a fire station and I got prepared for beeping. And no, it's a good stream. So I was wondering if among his things on the 100
working with us now, so we release the game like again so it's a code game against
Sorry, I didn't have your phone. But go for it.
Yeah, so it's much more we make a book and it's easy to understand stuff.
Like Empire of the Sun, he released all those Fortress free of charge. They just posted them all online and so you can download it. It wasn't something that was bought, so and that really helped boost interest. So yeah, so doing it as
Okay. And if they see their opponent, which is us, they try to attack us and take sure. So the aim is to make sure. But and the second one that was mentioned is the replayability. Creating like small pieces of so we can break them. So we're creating some maps and quests for player want to play, so you can play solo or with your friends. And if they want to play campaigns, you can
Yeah, do you want to? Yeah, do you want to spin over right now, or do you want to get? Do you want to get a coffee?
Oh boy! Very cool. What's your favorite album? I like my coffee. Like I like my coffee.
Okay, so like here is like sort of what it's out. This is like a little inspired by you. So like black lines mean they're dating, red lines mean they're cheating. Green lines mean they dislike each other. Dislike. Black dotted lines are not looking at them. Or it was like you spied on them doing a cheating. Yeah, so like we can see like this guy Lucas like has a lot of peaks and a lot of dislike. So if we like look up what's the deal with Twitter? Angry drunk. He's a teetotaler, but he's also drunk right now. He's a cheater. He's pious. He's pious and judgy, so he'll often judge others who he hates them, which then causes other people to just like, you guys, he's angry right now. So he's going around, he's drunk and he's angry, so he's going around cabins and underlying like this is what the like sort of simulation is. So
The whole point is that you don't want the stage to be unpredictable.
so there's like personality traits, default. This is like if you like someone, you're more likely to go with them. Nature trait, the effect that it has on how likely you are to play the character. So this means that you play those tags with actions are tags with like rating for atheist. But I mean, down to play extra. So like if you are a religious person, like you're more likely to do that. Also, you're more likely to do that. You're monogamous, you're less likely to do that.
I like the food. I might just have one. I like the food. You like or unlike? Great.
All right. Welcome everybody. We'll be starting our session on computational narrative. We will have 3 full papers and 2 DC short talks. So you can now try and travel back and see their posters yesterday. First talk will be by Michelangelo Diamante and David Tui on automatic extraction and refinement for simulations and adaptive level of detail.
So, good morning everybody, I'm Michelangelo Diamante, and today I will present to you the work that David Tui and I have been working on. What is level of detail adjustment? It's a concept that has been thoroughly studied in computer graphics. In fact, we have very many different techniques in which we can adjust level of detail of the graphical simulations to save resources. So, for example, we can shift between high poly models or low poly models based on the distance in which they are observed, or we can even avoid rendering whole parts of the scenes to save resources. But simulations, as we all know, are not only composed by the graphical component. In fact, there is a key component which is in charge of running the behavior of what's going on the screen. And so we would like to extend this concept of level of detail adjustment also to these behaviors. And the reason behind this is because we many times the games nowadays approach this problem in 2 different ways. So they either simulate everything that is part of the simulations, or they simulate only things that are directly observable by the user. But these things sometimes can make the world feel like it's not advancing unless the player is around. So with our approach, we would like to run also the parts that are not directly observable but with lower detail to save resources. And this poses some challenges. In fact, there is no standard way of encoding such behaviors, and they can span across different applications. So the optimization that we can find are context specific and sometimes not really reusable. That is not to say that the literature in this regard is scarce. In fact, we can find many examples that play with the adjustment of level of detail for social behavior or animations, spatial simplification, and also pathfinding, as we heard with some talks in this conference. But the most prominent example that is also an inspiration for our own work is maybe the one from Ben Sunshine Hill, the level of detail trader, which in a nutshell is a very advanced tool that trades the level of detail of a simulation based on a process that estimates for each character on the screen how important it is based on some metrics which span over observability, return time, the memory that the player has about that character, and then computes the probability of how likely we are to incur in a break in realism if we don't simulate the character well, and then balances the feature of the game for every character to simulate some in more detail and some in less detail, and balance among resources. But our approach is different in meaning that we want to design a framework in which we can model all sorts of simulations, and then when we run the simulation we want to avoid the computation of details if they are not observable by the user. And while the simulation is running, we would like to monitor the flow of the simulation and switch model as we need. So if we need to run a particular part of the simulation with high detail, then we use a detailed model or an abstract model which we can sacrifice some detail. So the framework that we decided to implement is based on PDDL, which is the Planning Domain Definition Language, and it is a language that is composed by a specification that is composed by two key components. One is the domain, so the domain is composed by all the elements that are used to describe what the problem looks like, so which kind of entities we're dealing with, which predicates we can use to have the relations that make part of the word, and which actions can any entity perform. And then we have also the problem description, which is a description of the current word state. And we have to specify that since we're dealing with level of details, we use one domain for each level of detail. So we're actually dealing with what we call multi-level domain simulations. So to give you an example of what we can model in our framework, we can imagine the player being an observer of the simulation, which is taking place on a planet. So maybe you have two rovers on a surface of a planet that can make some actions, and we can observe, we can imagine the space being divided in thresholds that represent the various level of details. So if you're far away from the simulation, then we would like to run the simulation at the abstract level. And if we go near the place where the simulation is taking place, then we want to raise the level of detail of the simulation. All right, so the example is, as I mentioned, about two rovers that can move among different places in the surface of the planet. So this is the first level of detail, the most abstract one, and they can perform some action. For example, taking pictures of some objectives and taking samples of the soil. Then if we move a little bit more closer to the planet, we can observe that there are actually obstacles that prevents the rovers to take some paths among some places. And then if we move a little bit closer on the most detailed level, we can also observe the battery system of each rover. So how can we use the PDDL specification to perform a simulation? Well, we have to first compute all the possible actions that we can apply to our word state. So we using all the entities that are part of our word, we get all the combinations of the action that we can perform, and then we apply the constraints that are part of the preconditions of the actions, and we match them with the relations that are true on our word state, and so we're left only with the actions that are applicable to our word state. Right, then now we have the actions that make up our transition model, and we can apply those actions to a word state and advance in the simulation. So you can imagine the simulation being represented as a tree, in which the nodes are the word state and the actions are the edges that connects to word state. And since we are dealing with multi-level domains, we have a tree structure for each level of detail. And the good thing about this tree representation is that we can just, since we will need the whole log of the story, we can just store the leaves in a memory structure and still have access to all the path of each level of detail story. Right, so what happens if the player was observing the simulation from a close perspective, so it was running the detail model, but it goes far away, so we can give up to some detail to save performances, but we still want to run something on that part of the environment. Right, since we have a multi-domain representation in PDL. We know that we have different domains for each level of detail. And for example, if we were going to from level of detail 3 to level of detail 2, we know that we give up to the detail of the battery system. So in this case, the domain will no longer have inside its specification all the elements that were concerning the battery system. So we give up all the entity types that make up the battery system, all the predicates that are concerning the battery system, and also the actions charge and discharge. And that, and with the new domain, the abstract domain, we can parse the current state. So we give up to all the details that are concerning the battery system, and we are left with a state that it's more abstract. And with the abstract transition model, we can then simulate the story at a much more abstract level, which is simpler to more performance efficient. The opposite process is called refinement, and it takes place when the player goes from maybe a low level of detail to a more like detailed model. So what we need to do in this case is refining the flow of the story that has unfolded so far to make up to the details that we didn't compute. So for example, we can imagine that the player has observed some actions of the rovers. So for example, let's say that the rovers moved to some places and took some images and then moved again. Then what if they go up to each rover and ask them, so now provide me the details of what you have been doing. So maybe the rover, let's say, replies saying that, I tried to move from one waypoint to another, but I know that there was an obstacle in between, so I had to go the way around, and so that they fill in all the details that are part of the new model. And to do that, we actually treat it as a planning problem. So we know that we have an abstract plan that we need to refine, and using search algorithms, we make up a plan that acts as an alibi for each entity that is performing actions. And we have some we had to tackle some challenges. For example, conflicting actions. If we allow different entities to perform parallel actions, then we need to check if these actions are conflicting one another. And so we came up with this definition, and we only allow the execution of parallel actions if their permutation leads to a consistent word state. So we compute all the possible permutations of two possible actions, and if they lead to a consistent word state, then we allow them, otherwise we don't. And another issue when we are refining plans is synchronization. So for example, if we refine a plan and then see that two entities need need different time steps to maybe perform some action. So for example, they have to give something to each other, then they need to meet at some point, and they need different time steps to reach the meeting point. Then we need to synchronize the plan, so we divide it into turns and assign idle actions if they need to wait one another. All right, so the last component that we designed and developed is the component that monitors the flow of the simulation and decides when to switch between level of details. And we did this by estimating some basic metrics of observability. So for example, we have the distance between the player and the place in which the simulation is taking place, and also the observability. And through a weighted average function, we come up with an estimator that tells us which level of detail to run. We actually implemented the environment that I gave you in the example, the one with the two rovers, and we tried to analyze the results. So we computed the size of the state space for each level of detail, and we can see that they grow exponentially when you add more and more details. So it's better to plan a low level of detail. And also we computed how many actions are expanded for each level of detail, and you can see that it's better to plan at a low level of detail because we expand way less actions. So there are some limitations. So for example, it's difficult to encode intent into these agents if you use DPDL formalism. It's difficult to estimate observability, and the refinement step needs to deal with the complex state space. And also in some cases, we cannot guarantee consistency of the refinement plan. There are some future works in which we can address these challenges. So for example, we can use probabilistic model to encode intent, and we can do also sorts of optimization to speed up the refinement. But the takeaway is that in general our approach works. In fact, we run the model that we need to save the resources, and then when we need to refine, to provide more details, then we can use our planner to go back in history and compute the details that were not previously computed. So that's all. If you need, you can refer to the paper for more details. Thank you.
Excellent. We have time for questions? Yes. Like a few slides back, you had the expanded actions, and there was actually a decrease from level 1 to level 2.
Yes. So the fact is that the complexity that we have added that from level 1 to level 2 is only a matter of constraint in the movement of the rovers. So even if we are adding some relations to describe this new constraint, they actually limit the actions that the rover can perform. So we actually expand fewer actions, but the state space is bigger.
Got it.
So, do I understand correctly that the different levels of abstraction, these levels of details, are given in advance, right, by hand?
Yes.
Do you think it could be possible to automatically discover these abstractions?
Yeah, so this, my talk was part of a bigger work, and we also tried to reason in terms of graphs. So if we represent a story with a graph, then we can study some parts of the graph and then abstract some parts away. So yeah, there are some ways in which we can automate this process.
Pardon me. In games, level of detail, AI level of detail is often switching between something smart and something random. So like with Ben Sunshine Hill's work on crowd scenes, you've got random behavior until the system decides you're paying attention to a character, and then it back solves not for the plan but for the goal. Have you thought about how switching between random and non-random might work in this framework?
All right. So the good thing about this framework is that since we're using the planners, then it's kind of guaranteed that you will come up with an alibi for actions that would seem random. They are justified by some constraint in the domain. So it's kind of justified by the planner, by the plan that it yields. But yeah, sometimes, as I said, it can break consistency if the actions are really random.
But you might be able to have a really, if you're doing a crowd scene, you could conceivably just have one operator, which is the behave randomly operator, or something like that. Because for a big crowd scene in a game, you've only got 2 milliseconds for all of AI. You're probably going to have your state machines for most of what's going on in the background.
Yeah, I didn't think about this specifically.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do you have
Yep. So throughout the talk, you kept mentioning terms like simulation and story and narrative, and you kind of are switching between them. But I don't know what, if any, narrative theory is represented in your system. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the way in which these various terms converge in a way is that we give you the framework to model a simulation through the PDL framework. So you can think of our framework being able to model different parts of a simulation. Then you can also encode the various actions and think about like transitions models that make those actions play together for a narrative. But that's not part of our framework itself. Like, so it's not a solution for simulating stories. It's more a solution of like how to model those simulations so that you can switch between those level of details.
Great. Excellent. Thank you much. Thank you again, Mike. So next up, we have another full paper being presented by Stephen Ware, and this is one of the artifact evaluated papers. So hopefully you had a chance to play with this.
I can walk around if I talk into the mic, right?
Just don't go under this.
Ooh, okay.
It's like a game.
Good to know. Hi everyone, thanks for sticking around to the last paper session. This is work that I did jointly with 3 of my PhD students, E.T. Garcia, Alex Gervani, Rachel Farrell. Alex is here, I believe. There he is, in the back. All of us are now at the University of Kentucky, except for E.T. Garcia, who is still at the University of New Orleans. Okay, so this is a paper about experience management. In what setting are we doing this work? Well, we are creating an interactive narrative where the player controls one of the characters, and the experience manager, the thing we're working on, controls all the non-player characters to jointly tell a story that meets some author-defined constraints. And so this definition does not include all interactive narratives, but it includes sort of a big enough group that we are happy.
Really more of a comment. That should say Riddell and Stern. It's a...
Oh, yeah. Very sorry about that. I have my my Mendeley database is wrong.
Review number 2, Mike.
Ooh.
Yeah. We go way back. I can tease, right?
Yeah, no, it's fine. This is actually not the first time this has happened in a live presentation with Mark. So okay. And by that I mean not the first time that I've gotten the citation wrong. Okay. Where was I? Okay, so we've got 3 sorts of things that can happen in these stories. We've got player actions where the player is the only one who has to choose to do it. We've got non-player character actions where the non-player character is the only one who has to choose to do it. And we've got joint actions where both the player and the non-player character have to have some reason to do it. So the abstraction, the way that we're representing our story is a story graph, and the words story graph and plot graph and other things, have been used sort of inconsistently throughout the literature. So what do we mean by a story graph? Well, we mean it's a state-space graph, so it's a graph where the nodes are states, and there are 3 kinds of edges, which are either player actions, joint actions, or NPC actions. So we've got a story graph, and so a path through this graph is a story. And some of these stories are good, meaning that they meet our author constraints, and some of them are bad. Okay, so there are many high-level approaches to how do you tell a good interactive story that meets these constraints. One of them, many story-based systems, what they do is they form a plan for what they want the non-player characters to do, and either what they expect the player to do or maybe what they hope the player is going to do. But if you've ever designed an interactive narrative, you know that players never do what you hope the players are going to do, or even what you expect them to do. So what do we do in that situation? Well, one option is we can intervene, which means the player tried to take an action that was going to screw up our beautiful story, so we just don't let it happen. The more ideal situation is we would accommodate, which is we actually just reorganize our story to allow the player to do that action. Hey, we can still tell a good story. The danger with accommodating, though, is all you're doing is checking to make sure that a good story can exist. So what if later down the line the player does more unexpected things, and that ends up putting you in a story that somehow does not meet your constraints? Basically, the problem is one of this, a system which every time it tries to accommodate, make sure that a new good story exists, says, well, for all player actions there exists a good story, but that's not good enough. What we would really like is to say, for all player actions, all possible stories are going to meet our author constraints. So that's what this paper was about. So what we're trying to do here is proactive mediation, which is the decisions we get to make, which are the joint and non-player character action decisions, or ones we get to contribute to. We want to make sure that we only take action such that no matter what the player does, we're still going to end up in a story that meets our constraints. Okay, so our goal is an interactive narrative where the author's goal is always achieved with no intervention. In every state, the player is always allowed to take any action which is possible. In other words, we're always trying to accommodate and never intervene. Okay, so how do we know the long-term implications of the choice on a space of possible stories? This is what makes this such a challenging problem. When someone makes an action, what consequences is that going to have 5 or 6 or 7 actions down the line? And we sort of punted on this question. We said, okay, you know what we're going to do? We're going to find a story domain where the entire story graph can fit in memory. That way, every time we make a decision, we know the long-term consequences on the space of possible stories we can tell. For this, we're using the Camelot interactive narrative environment. So thank you very much, Alex, for being the mastermind behind the Camelot environment. For those who haven't seen yet, this is an interactive environment that allows you to put a nice and easy, like 3D rendered experience on top of an experience manager. So we have a very simple domain. The player starts at home. There is also a market. There is a camp. And there's a crossroads that connects this is actually like a little microcosm from an earlier game called The Best Laid Plans. So the player starts off at home, there is a merchant in the market, there's also a guard in the market, and there's a bandit in the camp. The player starts with some money, the merchant has medicine, and your goal is to get the medicine. The merchant is also selling a sword, the guard has a sword, the bandit has a sword, and there's also some money sitting in the bandit's camp, like in a chest. So what can you do? You can walk around, you can buy stuff, you can sell stuff, you can rob people, you can attack people, you can take the money out of the chest, and you can tell the guard where the bandit is. So if you know where the bandit is, you can go up to the guard and say, hey, I've seen the bandit, and the guard will do whatever the guard's going to do, including going after the bandit. There's 2 possible endings. Either the player is going to return home with the medicine, or they're going to die trying. Very, very simple set of author, and this is what we mean by our author constraints. We want to make sure that every story ends with one of these 2 endings. How big is that story graph? Well, we needed about 2 terabytes of RAM to generate that story graph. And it seems like a really simple domain, right? Well, it takes up 2 terabytes of RAM. And here I'd like to acknowledge the Louisiana Optical Networking Initiative for giving us access to a supercomputer with that much RAM. Okay, so here's our basic method. We're going to start with the full story graph. Every possible state that could ever happen, every possible action that could ever happen. We're going to remove only non-player character and joint edges, so only the edges that we as the experience manager are allowed to choose to do or not. Until every node has all possible edges for the player, so the player can always do anything that is where the preconditions are satisfied, any action the player would expect to do in that moment. And we have 0 or 1 edges for non-player characters, so the non-player characters always know what they have to do. All the decisions have been made in advance. When the game is actually running, all the AI is doing is walking through the graph. Okay, so we did 8 kinds of pruning on this graph to get it down to what was the final story graph, and I'm just going to talk briefly about some of these. Obviously the details are in the paper, so I'm going to sort of take this chance to highlight some of the weird, interesting bugs that we found and why we did things this way and why we did it in this order. So the first thing, this is where like most of the real intelligence comes into our system, is we want to make sure that every agent who acts believes that that action is going to causally contribute to one of their goals. Otherwise, we're going to prune that action. So there's not a lot of time to go into this. This is a lot of our previous work on planning. But basically, there are actions that can actually happen. There are actions that characters think can happen. There are actions that contribute to a player's goal, and we're saying that believable actions are the ones in this space, the ones that characters think are possible and that they think are going to help them achieve their goals, even if it turns out they really aren't.
So basically, we apply a lot of our previous work on narrative planning, and we identify any edges that don't meet this definition, and we prune them. So after this pruning, our graph has about 388 million nodes and over 1 billion edges. These numbers are actually artificially small, because to do that belief reasoning, we have to reason about lots and lots of states that are actually impossible, but that characters believe are possible. So these numbers only reflect actual states that are really possible. The real graph we're working with is actually much larger. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is shorter plan pruning. So anytime an agent has 2 ways to achieve the same goal, we prune the longer plan. Why are we doing this so early? That's going to come up in a minute. Okay, so the next one, this was sort of the most controversial part of our system. This is the thing a lot of people were curious about or sort of disagreed with. This is a principle we're calling lazy NPC pruning. So when both a non-player character and the player have a way to achieve the same goal, we're going to wait for the player to do it instead of having the non-player character do it. Now, why did we do that? It's because we ran into weird situations like this. So the player, or the merchant wants to make money, the player wants the medicine, so obviously we've got like a natural pairing here. The player's going to go buy the medicine, right? When you don't do this, you get stuff like this. The merchant leaves the market and comes to you. It's like, oh, this is like not so bad, right? We've got these active NPCs. This is really great. Well, let's say you don't buy the medicine. Let's say you go to the crossroads. The merchant follows you. Then you go to the market. The merchant follows you. Basically, anywhere you go, the merchant's going to follow you around, constantly hoping. The merchant can't sell it to you without your consent. So the merchant, basically what you end up with in this situation is a posse of NPCs following you around, constantly hoping for one particular interaction. So this is why we are adopting a sort of lazy NPC principle. We're going to let the player come to them. All right, so when both the player and a non-player character could act to achieve the same goal, we prove the NPC action, and this is how our graph goes down. This takes quite a lot of volume out of our graph. The next one we're going to do is unique endings pruning. So anytime there are actions and they reduce the number of endings that are available, we want to least reduce the number of endings that are available. So the sort of design goal behind this is we want the player, not the experience manager, to be responsible for the ending that you get. So it's kind of a notable moment of agency when the player does something that reduces the available endings. That's good. We as the experience manager don't want to be defining what ending you're going to get. So here's another one of the little subtle things in our system. Why do we do shorter plan pruning so early? Specifically, why do we do it before unique endings pruning? Seems like maybe shorter plan is so simple, why don't we do that at the end? Because of weird situations like this. So let's say you, the player, are in the market, and you decide you're going to be a lawbreaker and you kill the merchant so you can take the medicine. Well, one thing the guard can do is the guard can just attack you and kill you. Like that seems like a reasonable thing the guard could do. Another thing the guard could do, this plan will technically work, is the guard could pick up the merchant's sword and use that to attack you. And you look at that and say, okay, this is like a clear situation where you've got 2 plans. One of them is unnecessarily long. Well, that kept happening. Players kept taking these weirdly, unnecessarily long sequences of actions to achieve their goal. And the reason we eventually figured out was because of the combinations of these 2 things. The guard picking up the merchant's sword does not reduce the number of endings that are available to the player. It's only when the guard attacks you that it reduces the number of endings to the player. So we were basically unintentionally biasing our characters towards these really unnecessarily long plans because they were cutting off the number of endings that were available. By the way, also the reason we're doing intentionality pruning first is to make sure that this does eventually happen. So the guard will eventually attack you, even though it reduces the number of endings. It's more important for characters to continue to be intentional than it is for them, for example, the bandit to just follow you around and never steal from you. So it's only when we have a choice of actions that we're doing that. All right, so the next one is goal priority pruning. When non-player characters have multiple plans they could be pursuing, how do we know which one we're going to do? Basically, they're always going to do their higher priority goals. Here's the reason why. The guard has 2 goals. The guard wants to punish criminals, and the guard wants to be at his post in the market. So when you see the bandit, you can go to the market and say, hey, guard, I saw the bandit. And the guard will say, okay, great, I'm going to go chase him. Goes to the crossroad. Then the guard says, wait, I'm not at my post. Wait, I've got to go get the bandit. Wait, I'm not at my post. And we end up with these weird sort of cyclic situations where characters are waffling back and forth between two goals and doing weird, like, repeated behavior. So we sort of applied a hack here which says goals have priority and you're always going to do the highest priority one first. The reason this is a dirty hack is because storytelling is non-Markovian. A lot of our previous work has sort of demonstrated the fact that it's not just about the state you're in, it's about how you got there. Our system, which is dealing with this giant graph, cannot keep track of your history. That would make this problem way, way, way harder. So this was kind of a dirty hack that we used to sort of, you know, account for the non-Markovian nature of storytelling. So when we do this, it cuts our graph down a little bit more. All right, then cycle pruning. This does not get rid of all cycles. When we have cycles, we detect them and break them. Finally, if we have many actions left for an NPC, we say they're all equally good. We pick one at random. And then the final one is dead-end pruning. We want to make sure that there are no states that you can get into where the game cannot end. And there were not very many. We only had to remove about 10 nodes and 12 edges from this giant graph to make sure that there weren't any dead ends left. But the fact that they still exist is proof that this storytelling, the long-term implications of a decision is a hard problem. Okay, so those are the different pruning techniques that we did. We did an evaluation here, which was a very simple setup. We compared the story graph that we made versus a control story graph. We went through a lot of different versions and a pilot study to determine what our control was going to be. In the end, we decided it's going to be a random story graph. That seems weird. There's lots of options for control. Why do we use random? Basically, the thing we are trying to control for is the built-in quality of this story domain. What are your chances of accidentally telling a good story in this domain? That's what we're trying to control for. So basically, we used a random story graph. Technically, it's not quite random because it turns out in a random story graph, there's a very high chance that some NPC just randomly kills you and you can't ever get to the ending where you complete the goal. So we did a little bit of a hack to make sure there's always at least one way that you can get the other ending. But it is basically a random story graph. Because of our pilot study where we found a huge ordering effect, basically people always liked the second one better in our pilot study, no matter what it was. So you actually explore the world first, then you play either the control or the experimental version in random order. So our evaluation, we basically asked 4 questions, and we had very encouraging results. So players agreed that our characters felt realistic. They agreed that characters reacted to things they saw and ignored things they did not see. We did not achieve statistical significance here, but you can tell based on the effect size that people preferred our version about 2 to 1, and with a larger sample size, we would have eventually achieved significance here, we believe. So characters tried to accomplish their goals, and also my actions had a significant effect on the story. So we, in this case, people are showing a pretty strong preference for our story graph. Okay, so what can we take away from this? One, story graphs get real big, real fast. Also, random story graphs are a surprisingly good baseline. So it's not that people disliked the random one and liked ours. They liked both story graphs a lot. They just liked ours more. So we had, just anecdotally, we had people jump through incredible mental hoops to explain the random behavior that they saw. Things like, oh, the first time I went to the market, the guard and the merchant were just standing there, but then I left and I came back and suddenly they were fighting, and I just assumed like maybe they were lovers and like they had a fight off screen while I was out there, and then when I came back they were fighting. It's like, no, it was just random behavior. But it sort of just goes to show like how we really want to narrativize everything we see, and so that's what that means is controlling for that is surprisingly hard, and random story graphs do a surprisingly good job of controlling for that. And also we need non-Markovian experience management. We're making a lot of simplifying assumptions in this domain. There are so many ways that we could make this problem more interesting and more intelligent. Also, we have an evaluated artifact, hooray. We have released the story graphs. Both the original story graph and the final story graph that have been compiled down into only 80 gigabytes instead of 2 terabytes. It has a lot of really great intentional information, including in every state, like what each character is like planning to do. So if you're interested in working with things like intentionality and belief, and you don't want to implement all the complicated algorithms we used for doing this, you can go download these graphs, and all that information is really like easily accessible for you. So I hope other people will have fun with these graphs. That's it. I just thank you for the NSF for supporting this work. Also, I just got another NSF grant to do intelligent storytelling in virtual reality, and I'm looking for PhD students. So if you are a undergrad or master's student looking to do a PhD, or if you have such students, please send them my way. Thanks.
Probably one question.
Oh, it's me. Paul.
So could you talk a little bit about the evaluation part where like these respondents chose a Likert scale kind of question, a preference question?
Yeah, so there's more detail in the paper.
Okay.
It was Likert scale questions. We attempted to do a between subjects analysis as well.
Okay.
It was not sufficiently, 2 groups of 10 is not sufficiently powered to draw any interesting conclusions, so the only results we're presenting are the between subjects, or the within subjects.
Was the stimuli randomized and counterbalanced?
Yes.
Okay, but you still saw a learning effect.
In the pilot study.
Okay.
In the first study we did, people always liked the second version better. So we added a situation where they get you. We think it's because, oh, they were exploring the environment, it was so cool, and then they were paying attention to the story in the second version. So basically we had them explore. They got all the shiny environment out of their system before playing either version.
Thank you.
I think that's it.
All right. Thank you.
All right, so our third full paper is going to be presented by Mortaza Behrooz, and this was the Best Student Paper Award winner from last night.
I actually don't see what is on the slides on my own screen, so I'm just going to look there. Is there a clicker? Is there a clicker or? Okay, yeah. All right. So this work was done by a lot of help from Justice Robertson, who just started at York University, and my advisor Arnav, who's here. Story quality as a matter of perception. Sorry. So story generation's future, as the story generation gets better, might have different shapes. But one of the things that is very likely to happen is expanding use cases of story generation. So not only in games and not only for particular kinds of entertainment, but it might involve things like interacting with agents or robots at, like, say, a museum, and you want to hear a story about them that's maybe situated in real world. And with that comes an increasing number of domains that these stories could be about. And with that comes unknown semantics of these domains, because if you wanted to model every single set of semantics that are related to stories in every single domain that the robot might want to tell a story about, or the agent, then you're basically solving a big chunk of AI. So that might not be really possible. So given that these use cases will expand and there will be a lot of domain semantics that we will be missing, story evaluation becomes more important. The following factors have implications for story evaluation. One is the use cases of storytelling. So if you have a particular context of storytelling and you're using your stories in that context, that will have implications for how the stories should probably be evaluated. And the other one is how much reliance you have on domain semantics. So as an example for the first one, if you have the audience consuming the story through an NPC in a game, is possibly different than having a robot that is socializing with you. So the expectations of the user is different. As a result of that, the evaluation, the ways we should evaluate as a story generation researchers, the stories should probably be also different. And the other one is, if you have the domain semantics of chess, you know that a story that involves checkmate is probably more interesting than a random sequences of events. So how could we evaluate stories? Human subjects are, of course, the gold standards of evaluation. That's the end goal, to make stories that people like. But it's costly to do that for every time we tune a model or we change the approach. And it's more fundamentally, when we generate stories, we want to, and as the use cases of storytelling is expanding, we want them to be able to be agile and adapt to a new domain. And with that comes possibly new standards of evaluation. So it's less predictable for us. In the absence of domain semantics, and particularly in kinds of storytelling like open story generation, there have been adaptations of other evaluation factors that people have used. So for example, people have been using NLP metrics that come from Blue, such as Blue or Pink, or coherence scores, and things that come from language complexity or other text coherence metrics. These can be very useful and will be a part of a good story. However, I'm sure all of us can think of good stories that are, have typos and are not really coherent, but are nonetheless interesting, and we would listen to them. So there was a great improvement in this line of work by last year's actually best student paper, Chris Purdy was Mark's student, which attempted to expand those metrics to the ones that are more specific to storytelling. But we want to go even further. We want to generate stories, evaluate generated stories as stories and not as generated text in general. Because Blue score and scores like that are originally designed to evaluate translation text and other things that are not necessarily stories. So evaluating stories as stories, what does that mean? Stories have cognitive and evolutionary roots in us. And to be able to focus on those roots that exist in our cognition, and psychology and cognitive science can tell us about it, in the evaluation of stories is key. And not so much necessarily just focusing on textual part of generating text and going down the route of focusing on scores like Blue and Pink and other coherence text scores. Turns out that humans appreciate stories in really particular ways. There is a lot of cognitive science and psychology research that shows the ways in which people might be engaged in a story that they read. So for example, psychology has shown that we do some sort of theory of mind-like behavior when we tell stories. We try to imagine how the audience's mind will go through the story that we're telling them, and we try to adjust the story to that. And these are so common and so widespread in our lives that we might not notice them, but the whole point is that humans are basically evolved with these senses, so these are really deeply in our cognition. So what do we perceive as interesting in stories? This is a very long line of research that goes back to Berlin, whose right pronunciation of his name I learned in a conference recently. I kept calling it Berlin, and someone was really nice, kind enough to tell me the right pronunciation finally. And Shank and others in AI. And through different lenses, people have tried to figure out what makes a story interesting. One of the categorizations that people have come up with is basically about the source of interest. So if it's about the predispositions in the listener, it's more experiential, more subjective, so we call that experiential interest. This includes things that, Shank, for example, has basic interests, things like power and money. And there are also cognitive interests that are more about perhaps the properties of stories. Now, you can't really separate where the source of the story is, because it's all about how the predispositions of the listener and the properties of the story really clash to each other in the act of listening or telling. But this is the motivation behind this loose categorization. And we focus on cognitive interests here to not be super subjective for every particular participant or audience. The most prevalent theory of what causes cognitive interest goes back to Campion from 2009, which is the most recent one, is predictive inference. So there is, Shank talked about unexpectedness. There are a lot of line of research that try to make that more specific. Maybe it's incongruity, maybe it's post-dictability, maybe it's inference, and then predictive inference seems to be one of the theories that is most compatible with other ones and most recent, and we just hang on to that. So basically, in a loose term, our mind as the listeners of the story would be guessing what will be happening next. And so that's regardless of the topic. And so if you're trying to guess what will happen next in the story, you're probably really interested in it, and your mind is running predictive inference. So the motivation comes to be considering perception in story generation. Given that psychology has told us that there is this theory of mind inspired way that people tell stories to each other, we try to keep the audience's mind in our mind to generate stories and try to appeal to that, whether it's a specific person or general properties of perceiving stories between people. Our goal is to inform story generation of some cognitive processes involved in the perception. I want to be careful with the claim. This is not a cognitive model comprehensively modeling how the stories are perceived. This is just trying to focus on what we can glean from the literature of cognitive science and trying to use that as signals that can help story generation in some way. There are many ways to expand this work. And we believe that this will help AI systems to be better storytellers, especially in cases like open story generation. So foreshadowing, it's a very common writing technique that leads to predictive inference. Not all cases of foreshadowing will generate predictive inference. They might be so subtle that only as a matter of post-dictability, later on you realize, oh, I think that part of the story was hinting at what just happened. But a lot of cases of foreshadowing can cause predictive inference in the reader. And so one question becomes, can we detect foreshadowing without a priori models of the domain semantics? So you don't have a graph of the semantics of the domain. You don't have basically anything of that particular domain. And can you guess if and how much predictive inference is caused in the user's mind? Oh, and I forgot to say that Rick and Morty, for the fans, that there's a lot of Easter eggs in the show, and that a lot of fans think that picture over there is hinting at what's going to happen in the episode later. So go look at it again.
Which episode is this?
Season 2, episode 1.
No.
I think it's the infinite.
I'm right.
Okay. All right. I believe in Adam. So considering this example story, basically two people go to a restaurant. There are other details in the story that might turn out to not matter much, but they drive to the restaurant, they play a song, they find a parking space and park, they go and order their favorite food. The waiter looks distracted and tired, but is polite while taking their order. Again, some song is played, trying to put some noise and see what happens, and then when the waiter returns, the food is wrong, and the waiter apologizes and returns with a few minutes later with the correct item, and they just enjoy the meal and pay for the food and go back home. So the approach that we had in this work is focuses on something basically very simple that we call moving cosine similarity. So given the story like that, if you remove the stop words, you can, and if you get the vector of every word in the story through some embedding space that you like. So for example, BERT embeddings is the one that we use here. The advantage of BERT embeddings and some of the other ones in this class in particular are that they keep context in mind. So if you have a word in a particular sentence, it has a different vector than a word in another sentence where the context is different. Whereas in comparison, in something like word2vec that is not contextual, you get the same vector for every word, regardless of the sentence it's in. So we basically get the BERT vectors just simply for all the words in the story after removing stop words and named entities. And we want to simulate the linear nature of perceiving the story. So there's a linear nature that you're listening to the story in time. And to do that, we have this concept of, again, super simple moving cosine similarity, which is for every word that is starting from the second sentence, so the first word of the second sentence, for every word, you get the cosine similarity of that word with the average of the vectors that precede it in the story. So all the words that come before that word in the story, they have a mean vector, and you get the cosine of the new word with the mean of the previous vectors. And for the story that we just saw, we see something like this. So, things go up and down, but then you realize there are two fairly noticeable dips in the story. And if you look closer, we see that those are actually the words that we had in bold in the story. So things like the food was wrong and the waiter was distracted. So the rest of the approach, we try to algorithmically find these two dips, which we just use a outlier detector, and we gradually decrease the sensitivity of it to find those two clusters or groups of words. And if we do find such, so here in the shape we have confidence that we see it, but in the story we don't know. So if we do find such two groups that could point to a foreshadowing, we will use two metrics that can guide us to a metric for putting a number on it. So the first is a cosine distance between the two groups that we have there and the rest of the story. So basically, these two outlier sort of groups in the story, how far are they from the average of the rest of the story? How much of an outlier are these words? And then the other one is how close are they together? Because if you have two dips in the story and they have nothing to do with each other, then that's not so much of a foreshadowing. They have to be also related. So sorry, and then we sort of sum those numbers and a third of that to have it between 0 and 1. And the idea is that the more outlier words you have in the story, the bigger the question mark in users' minds. So there's chances that you're having more predictive inference. To evaluate it, just quickly, we use 40 mechanical Turkers. We asked them to add a hint and a twist to 3 short stories. After they did that, we had a set of 120 augmented stories with a foreshadowing added to them by participants. For 83% of the cases, our approach yielded an M greater than 0 with that average. And then in the second phase of the study, we also chose, for each of the original stories, we chose a high M and a low M number, so a total of 6 stories. And we gave them to a new group of people and asked them how interesting these stories are. For 2 of the 3 original stories, the ones that with the greater M were more interesting to users. So that the goal is to correlate the user subjective evaluation. Concluding, as we get better in making stories, the use cases will expand, and probably the methods with which we can generate stories will also vary. And so for new use cases, it might be important to look at how the stories are perceived and try to use that as a guidance to help the generation of the story. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. Lara.
So I saw that you were asking the participants if the stories were interesting. I was wondering if you had a more detailed definition that you gave the participants, or you asked them in a certain way, because interesting can mean many different things.
Right. That's a very good question. Thank you. We struggled with that a lot.
Yeah.
Because it's there's basically, from a UX research point of view, or HCI research, you want to bias them as little as possible. So I think I just, at the risk of being vague, I just asked which one is a more interesting story for them, leaving the interpretation of it to them. And my justification for this, and I'm happy to be informed if there's a better way, was that the more I specify, the more I'm biasing their evaluation. So just asking which one's a better story, and whatever assumptions they make, I'm fine with it because, yeah.
Really cool talk. So you, if I understand it correctly, you look at cognitive literature as a way to guide the design of the system to understand analytically where you might identify points of foreshadowing and then cognitive interest. Is that fair to say?
Right. Except that there's no one particular system. This is just a proxy measure.
Right.
So yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So one point that could operationalize that cognitive theory.
Sure.
Then, but you do have an interest in generation, right? So you're saying we can take this, operationalize it, and then use it to guide generation.
Right.
Could you talk a little bit about how you might make that leap?
Yeah, absolutely. I think a very relatable, maybe in the context of story generation right now, work that is happening is actually partly by Mark's lab, is that to have neural story generation using language models that are happening. And a fairly recent development in that is that you can have controllable neural generation. So you can have signals that control, just GP2 doesn't just spit out text, but you actually control what it does through signals that you can introduce to it. So that could be, as one example, a signal that can help a neural generation method to go through path in generation through its,
cognitive interest.
Yeah, that would lead it to where we think probably there is cognitive interest. So, right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So next we have two DC doctoral consortium short talks. First one will be by Rashid Sanrajka, I apologize.
Hey everybody, my name is Rush and I'm a student at the University of Utah. I work in the liquid narrative group with Michael Young, and I'm here to talk about my research topic, which is interactive narrative authoring using cognitive models of emotion in narrative planning, which was also a poster yesterday. So I want to start by telling you guys to all think of a particular narrative that you really like, whether it's from an RPG, or a movie, or a book, or a play that you really like. And raise your hand if you were touched by the emotional journey that characters make in it, or the emotional journey that you go on while experiencing that narrative. Okay. So that's what I'm trying to talk about, and the main motivation behind my work is that I want to make a meaningful contribution to help people assist authors who create these kinds of stories. And I want to go beyond the simple surface structure of the story and give deeper insights about, for example, allowing authors to navigate and explore their stories through the emotional journeys of characters or audience that would experience while going through the story. So there's been a lot of work done in narrative planning to come up with contributions that allow for story structures and narrative structures. But not a lot of work has been done in connecting it to authors to increase expressivity. And I really like that the AIIDE community is now taking steps to add in the designers and game developers into the loop of experience management. I want to do something similar for authors, whether they are working with a medium, whether it's story, or whether it's books or movies, but just like the planning of what their story is going to be like. The way I'd like to do this is taking the perspective of emotions and using and leveraging the cognitive models from cognitive psychologists about affect and emotional reasoning. So in order to do this, first I would need to identify a computational model of emotion. There are quite a few computational models of emotion that are used to predict agent behavior and coping mechanisms, which I talked about in my poster yesterday. And the next step would be to connect these models to narrative planning. In order to do this, I would need to analyze and figure out what parts of stories do authors care about in terms of manipulating emotions for their characters, and then come up with the right features in those computational models of emotion. And finally, once that is done, I'm trying to go back to my motivation, which is try to figure out a meaningful way to interact for authors who have very little computational or cognitive knowledge about emotions, and see how they can interact with the AI and manipulate and explore and navigate this huge space of stories that is the output of narrative planners, using this extra dimension of emotional journeys. So yeah, that's my research topic, and I'd appreciate any feedback or any experience people have had about regarding this topic. Thank you.
I don't have any slides.
Yeah, I have slides on my machine if we want to bother or not.
Your choice.
Might as well.
Quick setup here. Our last doctoral consortium talk will be by Max Kreminsky. He was also one of the co-organizers of Exag, which kicked everything off, so we have bookending. Nice, narratively good thing to do.
Hero's journey.
Yeah. Kudos to the program master.
It was very
Cool. Yeah. So as you may have already seen at my poster yesterday, I'm doing creativity support for story construction play experiences. And what that means is that I do 3 different things. One of them is build playable experiences that function as storytelling partners for the player. So you're looking at things like Cozy Mystery Construction Kit, which is a game that I've been working on that sort of has 2 different players working together with a computer to tell a story basically together. Where it's a simulated story world that has a sort of initial generated scenario with characters in it with sort of like social relationships between them and stuff like that. And the computer is sort of tracking what those characters want to do motivation-wise, like sort of using a social model of motivation. And then also what the authors, the players, want to sort of get out of their story in terms of the author goals they want to achieve. The simulation then sort of like suggests actions for those characters to do that are both sort of pleasantly motivated and that help achieve the author goals. There's a running transcript of like sort of the actions that have taken place so far, and players can edit the sort of generated descriptions of these actions that are by default produced by the system to sort of flesh it out into a single sort of coherent narrative artifact. I also built technology to help support these kinds of things. So things like this felt system, which does story sifting, to borrow a term from James Ryan, which sort of looks at all the events that have happened in a simulated story world, pulls out sort of narratively interesting patterns of events that have been specified by sort of like system author or domain author, and sort of suggests things to the player that they might want to incorporate into the stories, whether that's sort of the build up to a cycle of revenge between 2 characters, or the beginning of a love triangle, or something like that sort of has narrative potency of some sort. And then that's going to be at AIIDE this year. And then finally, some theoretical analyses of story construction play practices that are already out there in the wild, so like players telling Dwarf Fortress stories, or players sort of like telling stories about their play experiences in general, looking at sort of what the contents of those stories are, how we can better support that kind of storytelling practice, and sort of looking at it as an emerging form of deeply computationally engaged creative practice that happens to involve this like use of simulations or games to overcome creative barriers and produce sort of narrative based on play experiences. So yeah, that's what I do, and I'm doing more of it. Thank you.
Great. So that's the end of the narrative computation session, the end of our technical program, and I think Jillian is going to wrap us up.
Could I borrow a USB-C HDMI dongle, please? Someone? I wasn't going to do slides, so I didn't prepare. I did slides.
You got it.
Yeah?
Oh,
so slow.
I had to walk all the way across the room.
Oh yeah, it is interesting. You can't actually see. Oh god, I can't see the thing. Okay.
Just change to mirroring.
Yeah, I'm just gonna do that.
Screen.
Please tell me that happened.
Yeah.
Cool. Oh, that's unhelpful. Off the road. Thank you. Yes. All right. So thank you all for coming to the 15th AIIDE conference on artificial intelligence and interactive digital entertainment. So at opening, we said like, happy birthday, AIIDE. And then last night, way too late at night, in the lobby of the hotel was like an impromptu AIIDE history lesson. And during this impromptu AIDE history lesson, I remembered that actually AIDE is 20 years old today. So for those of you who are new to the AIDE community, AIDE started as a spring symposium run through AAAI, the 1999 AAAI Spring Symposium on Artificial Intelligence in Computer Games. It is well worth the dive into the AAAI digital library to see the technical report that arose from a 20-year-old AI and Games symposium. But I wanted to give a few shout outs to some of my favorites. So the only author who is present today, who was also present 20 years ago, is Ian Horswell.
Rob Zubek has his own game company, successful game company.
Yeah. Many of the authors who were there are still part of our community. They're just not here this year. Some of them, their students are here. Actually, myself included, my co-advisor was one of the authors in that symposium. But Ian's the one who's like, stuck it out and come. Happy birthday, Ian. There's also some really familiar themes, right, from the 1999 symposium. So it struck me that the wonderful keynote that we had this morning from Jeff, one of the first papers in the technical report from '99 is explicitly looking at the intersection of military simulation and computer games. Now this was digital military simulation, but that rose from analog military simulation and wargaming. So we've been looking at this history for a while in our community as well. Last year, our theme was situated entertainment, and John and I wanted to explicitly look at how AI is situated in contexts, and how AI is situated in the context that arise from computer games. 1999 was a situated AI paper from Mark Cavazza, Shrikant Bandi, and Ian Parma. We talk about explainable AI a lot these days. It turns out in 1999 we also talked about explainable AI a lot, and maybe one of my favorite paper titles ever. 20 years. Still haven't done it, guys.
I want to visit the Complex Games Lab at the Electrotechnical Laboratory.
As do I, and in fact, Flo came here from Japan, so we have Japanese representation in 1999 and 2019. Our best student paper today, right, is on cognitive science and games. 1999, there was a definite interest in cognitive modeling, so John Funge's Cognitive Modeling for Computer Games. And it wouldn't be an AIDE without me making fun of Michael Matthias. Michael is responsible for getting me into the AIDE community. 11 years ago was my first AIDE. I hope for those of you who are here for the first time, we'll see you a decade from now as well. And you'll reflect on how ridiculous it is that you've been coming to this conference for that long. But yeah, Michael's Not Your Grandmother's Game, AI-based art and entertainment, I believe has inspired my AIDE 2020 paper, Your Grandmother's Game.
Are you not planning 2 years in advance?
What?
Are you not planning 2 years in advance?
No, Steve Matthews is the one who plans his AIDE papers 2 years in advance. If anyone else does, good for you. I'm averaging like 4 months. This is a new thing. So with that, I thought it would be nice if we had a moment for community announcements. I know I've been hearing a lot about like jobs that are open and grad students who are being looked for and exciting things going on in our lives. So if anyone has anything that they want to share with people you're looking for, now is the time to do it. Rogelio.
Hello, everybody. You've probably seen me around already. I'm Rogelio. So the University of Utah's EAE program, Entertainment, Arts, and Engineering, the teaching-focused program that focuses on instruction around video games, is hiring a teaching faculty. So it's non-tenure track, it's research-friendly, but you'll be there primarily to teach. So if you're interested in teaching the next generation of game developers at GamerU, which Jillian has continuously made fun of me the entire time for.
It's worth it, I recommend it.
Yes, now please do consider applying. A terminal degree is required. And we're looking broadly in the area of game engineering, including game AI. So please talk to me offline if you'd like. And also personally, this year, actually, a lot of my students will be leaving the lab. I am trying to convince Alex to stay, but you know. So if you are interested in looking at topics at the intersection of AI, game design, virtual reality, and storytelling, please come talk to me.
It's really fun.
You said endorsement. Very fun.
You said Utah?
University of Utah, correct.
Give me you. Yeah.
What part of Utah?
Salt Lake City.
Cal Poly Pomona, where I'm at, is hiring 2 tenure line assistant professors this year. We are not in R1 like was presented yesterday at the panel. So there are different different things are valued and rewarded there. But if you are looking for a tenure line assistant professorship and want to know what it's like to be at a more teaching-focused school, but that still values research to some degree, although in different ways than what R1s do, and are interested in the position, you can reach out to me and we can talk more.
I got one too. So Scripps College, it's a women's college in the Claremont Colleges Consortium, is looking for a computationalist artist person with technical background, somebody like a computational media type person could be a pretty good fit. It's a tenure track position. Pomona College, where I am, might also be hiring a computer science person. We don't know yet if that's happening, but we'll know within a couple weeks. It's really great working at a liberal arts college. Please talk to me if you have any questions about it. And mostly they leave me alone and I can do research and teach 2 and 2.
So you're in California?
Yeah, it's not in California. It's like east.
I actually got an aunt that lives in Pomona.
It's like east LA County.
It's right by Caltech over there, right?
It's further east than it's almost San Bernardino County.
Yeah. Okay.
As far east as you can get in LA County.
Okay. But it's really nice, and I recommend
it. Is very.
So please talk to me if you have questions. I'll be here all day. Not here.
Any other announcements and jobs? Oh, I'm sorry, I couldn't see you, John.
No worries, yeah. A little line of sight problem there.
Yeah.
UC Davis, University of California Davis, will be hiring 4 people in the computer science department each year for the foreseeable future, really in case of retirements. But some of those jobs will be friendly to computational media and games AI folks. So if you're interested, please take a look. You know, we're on the lower side of R1, I guess. So the expectations are just mitigated a little bit. So if you're interested, come talk to me. Thank you.
How's this glare coming from the football field?
That's right,
Yeah.
So, University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley. We are one of the UT satellite campuses. We just recently minted R2 status. So again, more of a blend of teaching and research. We don't have PhD students. The research looks a lot similar to what you're used to at most of our universities, except that you don't have PhD students and you don't have a lot of the money stress. We are hiring tenure track this year.
I can close with my announcement. So WPI Computer Science has 2 tenure line openings this year. It's not explicitly in the interactive media and game development program. You would have to look like very computer science-y, which many of you in this room do. But it's an exciting place to be able to have intersection opportunities with interactive media and game development. In learning sciences and technologies, we are also hiring 2 tenure lines. One that's more in educational psychology, so maybe you've got some friends who are interested in this, and one that's more open in learning and educational technologies. Again, a games-friendly person would be very welcome. We're always looking for people to connect to other areas at WPI. And if you are an undergraduate student looking for graduate programs, WPI has a very strange funding model. But we do have a limited number of TA positions every year that doesn't require you to go through the grant stress. And I do know that we will have some of those available this year. We also operate on a rolling admission deadline. So if you were to apply today, you can start in the spring. Other than people who have very strange visa issues, in which we work with you, but like a little more leeway. Any other announcements? So I just wanted to recap and congratulate again Best Paper, Best Reviewer, Best Artifact Award winners. So these were all announced last night. but I know not everyone could make it to the reception last night. So I'm going to put them up here. So best paper, macro action selection with deep reinforcement learning in StarCraft. Best student paper, story quality as a matter of perception, using word embeddings to estimate cognitive interests. Should we just stop? Best PC member is a very difficult decision. It's Peter Mulholland, who I know isn't here, but if you see him on Twitter, please congratulate him. And best artifacts, analysis of statistical forward planning methods in content. It's not too late to share your AIIDE experiences on social media. In particular, Sasha is right back there. Everyone should give a big round of applause to Sasha. Run the AIIDE conference account while here, although Matthew Gusdale is also behind that AIIDE conference account, but couldn't make it this year. But in particular, Sasha has recorded and streamed every single talk at AIIDE this year except for the career mentorship account. So they auto-archive on YouTube, right, Sasha? Yeah. So
there's an AIIDE 19 playlist.
Excellent. So this is a great way to be able to revisit your favorite talks, share talks with students. I know I've had a student who went through the live stream in the past to be able to look at like what does the AIIDE talk look like anyway, to be able to figure out how to best prepare for a talk this year. So it's a really nice resource. And then the AIIDE attendees Slack will still be open and hopefully be used again next year. But in the meantime, you can join in and hang out with all your AIIDE friends online when you're not here. I wanted to thank again everyone on the organizing committee, lady who I am now about to pass this job over to for a wonderful job as program chair, Mark Nelson, workshops chair, Joe Osborne, doctoral consortium chair, Corey Matthewson, Playable Experiences chair, Sasha Azad, Matthew Gusdale, publicity co-chairs, Stella Mazeka and Sam Snodgrass, artifact evaluation co-chairs, Dave Churchill and Richard Kelly, StarCraft competition co-chairs, Kartik Kinney, our industry chair, and Laura Martin, our local arrangements chair. So thank you to all of them. This conference did not happen. We should thank the National Science Foundation for providing very generous travel support funding for doctoral consortium playable experience, some playable experiences, some mentors, and then a significant portion of the lunch costs on the first day of the main conference are all coming from National Science Foundation funds, so thank you to them. And then like a bunch of offices all over Georgia Tech who have very kindly given us funds to be able to host the conference, in large part thanks to the efforts of Ed Sullivan here and also Mark Riddell here for putting in applications and talking to lots of people, and I'm sure a lot of them. I wanted to thank the people who we invited and who gave their precious time to be able to share their ideas with you. So our keynote speakers, Kate Compton, Ayana Howard, and Jeff Engelstein, and our career mentorship panelists, Mark Riddell, Ann Sullivan, Chris Martins, Rogelio Cardona Rivera, and Kate Compton. At Georgia Tech, Ann Sullivan for a lot of behind-the-scenes support. And I really don't think it's possible to like overstate how much logistical support and herding cats support AAAI provides to this conference. It is immense, it is invisible, and it is astonishing. So whenever you get those emails from Carol Hamilton and Stephanie Lay over at AAAI, please remember that they are very overworked and that they are very wonderful people, and we owe them our thanks for this event happening. General chair of AIIDE 2020.
Thanks, Jillian. So we should also thank Jillian for all the hard work as a general chair. And we hope to see you all next year. So we have placed a bid for next year's AIIDE, and I hope to have some news in the next couple of weeks. So we're going to keep you posted. So thanks so much for coming, and we all hope to see you next year. Thank you.
And a very safe travel zone.
So we keep in touch. I'll send you an email. My
Big idea.
I just want the summer. Like I know, yeah, not to get there.
I know.
It's not like here. It's not like I don't know how bad Nice to meet you as well. I wanted to just, I'd like to take on some role next year, so, okay. Is there anything no, but I don't know, maybe something like workshop chair or something like that. That's all I had. Okay, you got it. Cool, great. Got it. Yeah, awesome. How are you doing? Yeah, I haven't chance to talk to you all.
I'm doing all right. So I'm heading to Canada in January.
Oh.
So my partner, she lives in Edmonton.
Okay.
I'm going to be an assistant prof at the U of A.
Okay.
But it's going to be for some amount of time, so she could finish and then
Yeah.